The autumn of 1847 came to the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee, not with the gentle fall of leaves, but with the whisper of a name that would burn itself into the soul of a region. In the flickering lamplight of a slave quarter on the Whitmore plantation, outside the town of Crossville, a child was born under a harvest moon so red it seemed the sky itself had begun to bleed. The midwife's scream shattered the night not from the pain of labor, but from what she saw when the infant opened its eyes. One eye, pale as winter ice, the other, dark as the earth from which cotton grew. They called it an omen. They called it a curse. They called them witch eyes, and the girl who bore them would become something far more dangerous than any superstition. She would become a legend wrapped in terror, a ghost story whispered across state lines, and a mystery that no amount of blood or fire could ever fully silence. Heterochromia, the medical term for two different colored eyes, was understood by few and feared by many in the antebellum South, where science bowed to superstition, and the unknown was always demonic. But this was no simple quirk of genetics. The child, named Ayodele by her mother, in secret a Yoruba name, meaning joy has come home, was born into a world that would never allow her joy, only dread. The plantation overseers whispered she could see into men's souls, predict death, and curse crops with a glance. The enslaved community was divided. Some believed she was a prophet, sent by ancestors. Others feared she would bring the wrath of white masters down upon them all. What no one could deny was the inexplicable occurrences that followed her 3 overseers dead within her first 5 years of life, each under circumstances that defied explanation, each having threatened or harmed her mother. The Whitmore family, God-fearing Presbyterians who prided themselves on order and dominion, found themselves haunted by a child they could neither kill nor sell, for no trader would take her, and no neighboring plantation would accept the witch child onto their land. By the time Ayodele turned 7, her reputation had metastasized beyond the boundaries of Crossville, carried by travelers and traders into the folklore of 3 states. She was no longer merely a slave girl with an unusual appearance. She had become a symbol, a walking contradiction in a society built on the illusion of absolute control. And if you think the story ends with superstition and childhood, then you have not yet understood the depths of what those witch eyes would witness, nor the reckoning they would bring upon the men who believed they could own the unownable. Stay with this tale, let it crawl beneath your skin, and when you reach its end, share it, because some stories are not meant to be forgotten, but to be passed like warnings in the dark. What follows is not just the biography of a girl born different, but the chronicle of how one soul's existence unraveled the certainty of an entire social order, one death at a time. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across 400 acres of Tennessee clay and shadow, a kingdom of tobacco and human misery ruled by Colonel Thaddeus Whitmore, a man whose wealth was measured in souls and whose cruelty was legendary even among his peers. The big house stood at the plantation's heart like a white-columned temple to dominion, its Greek revival architecture a monument to the lie that civilization could be built on chains. Behind it, arranged in deliberate rows that mimicked military precision, stood the slave quarters, 23 cabins of rough-hewn timber and clay chinking, each housing between 6 and 10 human beings, treated with less care than the colonel's hunting dogs. This was the world into which Ayodele was born, a world where black bodies were inventory, where families were dissolved on a whim, where a child could be sold away from her mother before she learned to walk. The Whitmore family, the colonel, his wife Constance, and their 3 sons, Martin, David, and the youngest, Thomas, sat at the pinnacle of this hierarchy, dispensing judgment and punishment with the casual brutality of those who believed their authority came directly from God. Below them existed a carefully maintained structure of overseers, slave drivers, and house servants, each layer crushing the one beneath it. The field hands worked from can't see to can't see, sunrise to sunset, their bodies breaking under the weight of quotas and whips. But Ayodele's mother, Neka, occupied a strange position. She was a house servant, working in the kitchen, privy to the family's secrets and conversations, educated enough to read a crime and Tennessee law, and beautiful enough that the colonel's eldest son, Martin, had noticed her. This proximity to power would prove both blessing and curse, for it was in the big house's kitchen that Neka learned the Whitmores' deepest fears, their financial troubles, their barely concealed hatreds for one another. And it was there, 9 months before Ayodele's birth, that Martin Whitmore had forced himself upon Nneka in the pantry while his mother entertained guests in the parlor. The child with witch eyes carried in her veins the blood of both enslaved and enslaver, a living embodiment of the South's greatest unspoken sin. The midwife who delivered Iodele was a woman named Ruth, herself a slave, who had brought over 200 children into the world across 4 decades of bondage. She had seen breech births, stillbirths, twins tangled like rope, infants born with cawls over their faces, portents, the old folks said, marked a child for prophecy or doom. But she had never seen eyes like these. When Iodele emerged from her mother's womb, the left eye was a brown so deep it appeared black in the lamplight, the color of fertile soil and ancestral memory. The right eye was a pale, gray-blue, almost translucent, like looking through creek water at stones beneath. Ruth's hands trembled as she cut the umbilical cord, her lips moving in silent prayer to gods both Christian and older, gods whose names had survived the Middle Passage when everything else had been stripped away. Nneka, exhausted and bleeding on the cornshuck mattress, reached for her daughter with desperate hands. "Let me see her," she whispered, her voice raw from hours of labor. When Ruth placed the infant in her arms and Nneka looked into those mismatched eyes, she did not scream, she did not recoil. Instead, she smiled, a strange, knowing smile that unsettled Ruth more than any cry of fear could have. "She is marked," Nneka said softly, speaking in English but with the cadence of her mother's Yoruba, a language she'd been forbidden to speak aloud. "The ancestors have touched her. She will see what others cannot. She will know what others do not." Ruth backed toward the door, suddenly eager to be away from this cabin, from this child, from whatever prophecy was unfolding. "You need to be careful, Nneka," she warned. "The mistress will hear about this. The colonel will hear. Eyes like that. They'll say she's cursed. They'll say she's evil." Nneka pulled her daughter close, feeling the infant's heartbeat against her own. "Let them say what they will," she replied, her voice hardening into something that resembled defiance, or perhaps resignation to a fate already written. "They have called us less than human for so long, they have forgotten that the divine can be born in a slave cabin just as easily as in their big house. Maybe easier." The first overseer to die was a man named Silas Crawford, a transplant from Georgia, with a reputation for brutality that preceded him like a foul wind. He was 28 years old, built like a bull, with arms thick from wielding both whip and rope. He carried a coiled bullwhip on his belt at all times, and he used it liberally on men, women, even children who failed to meet their picking quotas. Silas had a particular hatred for Nneka, perhaps because she could read and he could not, perhaps because she served in the big house while he remained outside in the mud and heat, perhaps simply because cruelty needs no reason beyond opportunity. When Iodele was 3 years old, barely able to form complete sentences, Silas caught Nneka, teaching her daughter to recognize letters scratched in the dirt outside their cabin. Literacy was forbidden by Tennessee law. A slave who could read could forge travel papers, could read abolitionist literature, could imagine freedom in words that had the power to reshape reality. Silas grabbed Nneka by her hair and dragged her toward the whipping post, shouting that he would make an example of her, that Colonel Whitmore would hear of this transgression. Little Iodele, with her strange eyes wide and glistening, ran after them, screaming for her mother. Silas turned, raising his hand to strike the child, and in that moment witnesses would later swear to this. Iodele's pale eye seemed to catch the sunlight in a way that was not natural, seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. She stared at Silas Crawford and said in a voice too deep for a 3-year-old child, "You will die." Screaming, Silas laughed, a harsh bark of derision, and shoved the girl into the dirt. He whipped Nneka 20 lashes, leaving her back a landscape of opened flesh. That night, Silas Crawford went to the barn to check on a mare in foal. His body was found the next morning, trampled beyond recognition, every bone in his face shattered, his eyes gone from their sockets. The mare stood calmly in her stall, utterly unbothered, without a spot of blood on her hooves. The death of Silas Crawford should have been written off as an unfortunate accident. Horses were unpredictable. Creatures and men died on plantations with grim regularity from disease, violence, and misfortune. But the enslaved community knew better. They had heard Iodele's pronouncement. They had seen the unnatural light in her pale eye. Within days, the story had been embellished and expanded. Some said Iodele had whispered to the horse in a language older than English, older than Yoruba, older than human speech itself. Others claimed they had seen the child standing outside the barn at midnight, her shadow cast in 2 different directions by a moon that should have created only one. The white overseers grew nervous, though they would never admit it. They avoided looking directly at Iodele when they passed her in the yard. They made signs against evil when her shadow crossed their path. Colonel Whitmore, a practical man who prided himself on rationality and Protestant sensibility, dismissed the talk as superstitious nonsense. "The child has a medical condition, nothing more," he announced at dinner, cutting into his roasted pork with decisive strokes. "Heterochromia, iridium. I read about it in a medical journal from Philadelphia. It's a quirk of pigmentation, not witchcraft." His wife Constance, a thin woman whose beauty had been carved away by years of maintaining appearances, set down her fork with trembling hands. "Medical condition or not, Thaddeus, the slaves are frightened. The overseers are frightened. That child is unsettling." Martin Whitmore, now 26 and managing much of the plantation's daily operations, leaned back in his chair, swirling brandy in a crystal glass. He had never acknowledged Iodele as his daughter would never acknowledge her, but sometimes when he saw her in the yard, he felt an uncomfortable recognition. A mirror, held up to something he preferred to keep hidden. "Perhaps we should sell her," he suggested casually. "Send her downriver to New Orleans. There are markets there that specialize in curiosities." But every trader who came to evaluate Iodele took one look at those mismatched eyes and refused to make an offer. Some crossed themselves. Others simply rode away, without explanation. The second overseer to die was named Jacob Pruitt, and he was, by the standards of the institution he served, considered a reasonable man. He did not whip for pleasure, only for productivity. He did not separate families unless economics demanded it. He read his Bible every evening and believed genuinely that slavery was God's plan for the lesser races, a burden the white man bore for the civilization of the savage. Jacob Pruitt's fatal mistake was not cruelty but curiosity. When Iodele turned 5, he became fascinated by her condition, by the way her eyes seemed to track things that were not there, by the rumors of her predictions. He began to watch her, to follow her movements, to document in a leather journal what he called observations of the anomalous Negro child. He noted that dogs would not approach her, that birds fell silent when she walked beneath trees, that she sometimes spoke to empty air in a language he could not identify. One afternoon, he cornered Nneka in the summer kitchen and demanded answers. "What is she?" he asked, his voice tight with an emotion, somewhere between fear and fascination. "What did you birth into this world?" Nneka, stirring a pot of soup for the Whitmore family's supper, did not look up. "She is my daughter," she replied simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." Jacob grabbed her wrist, forcing her to face him. "I've seen her, talking to shadows. I've seen her eyes glow in the dark like an animal's. Tell me the truth, woman, or I'll have you sold so far south you'll never see her again." Nneka pulled her arm free, and for the first time, Jacob saw in her face something that terrified him, not anger, but pity. "You want truth, Mr. Pruitt? Here is truth. My daughter sees what is coming. She sees death before it arrives. And Mr. Pruitt," Nika's voice dropped to a whisper, "she has been staring at you for 3 days now with an expression I know too well." Jacob Pruitt laughed nervously and left the kitchen. That night, he fell down the stairs of his cabin, a staircase he had climbed 1,000 times, and broke his neck. Witnesses said they heard a child singing just before he fell. Nneka understood that her daughter's gift, if gift it was and not curse, would either save her or destroy her, and the difference would lie in knowledge. So in the darkest hours of night, when the overseers slept and the moon was a sliver offering little light for patrollers to hunt by, she taught Iodele everything she knew. She taught her the names of plants that could heal and plants that could kill. Knowledge, passed down from her own mother, who had learned it from hers, an unbroken chain of women's wisdom stretching back to Africa. She taught her to read, using a tattered copy of the Bible stolen from the big house, because even in bondage, words were weapons, and the enslaved needed every weapon they could hide. She taught her the stories of their people, not the stories the white folks told about happy slaves singing in fields, but the real stories of resistance and rebellion, of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, of the Underground Railroad that ran like a secret river through the land, carrying souls toward freedom. And she taught her about the eyes, about what they meant in the old ways, in the traditions that predated the slave ships. In Yoruba belief, Nneka whispered, her lips close to Ayodele's ear as they sat in darkness. There are those who are born between worlds, who can see into the spirit realm and the human realm simultaneously. The Yoruba call them alawaran, those with the sight. Your eyes are not a curse, my daughter. They are a door, and you stand in the doorway. Ayodele, now 7 years old, listened with the intensity of someone much older. What do I do with this door, Mama? She asked. Nneka was quiet for a long time, her hand stroking her daughter's hair, feeling the coarseness that marked her as black and the slight wave that betrayed her mixed heritage. You survive, she finally said. You learn, you watch, and when the time comes, and it will come, you decide whether to close the door or let something through it. The lessons continued for years, always in secret, always in darkness, building in Ayodele a foundation of knowledge that would prove far more dangerous than any supernatural power her eyes might possess. By 1855, when Ayodele was 8 years old, Colonel Thaddeus Whitmore faced a problem that his wealth and authority could not easily solve. The plantation was hemorrhaging overseers. 5 men in 8 years had died under circumstances that ranged from inexplicable to impossible. Word had spread throughout the Bizant county and beyond. No experienced overseer would accept a position at the Whitmore plantation, regardless of wages offered. Those who did come were desperate men, drifters, failures from other plantations, and they rarely lasted more than a few months before finding reasons to leave. Some claimed illness, others simply disappeared in the night. The enslaved population, meanwhile, had grown emboldened in subtle ways. Productivity remained adequate, but the atmosphere had changed. There was less cowering, less immediate obedience, a new calculation in the eyes of even the most beaten down field hand. They had seen the pattern. They understood, in ways the colonel could not or would not acknowledge, that something protected them or at least made their oppressors vulnerable. Colonel Whitmore called a family meeting in his study, a room lined with books he had purchased by the shelf foot to convey intellectualism he did not possess. His 3 sons sat before him. Martin, now 34 and bitter that his father would not retire and cede control. David, 31 and soft, preferring poetry to plantation management. And Thomas, the youngest at 27, who had inherited all his father's cruelty with none of his restraint. We cannot continue like this, the colonel said, pouring whiskey into cut crystal glasses. The rumors about that girl are destroying our reputation. Neighboring plantations whisper about us. Our property value is declining. I've had inquiries from buyers, but they offer insulting amounts, and they all mention the witch child as justification for their low bids. Thomas, who had been drinking since breakfast, slammed his glass on the desk. Then kill her. Kill the girl and her mother. Burn them in front of everyone. Show the niggers that there's no protection, no magic, just white authority and black submission. Martin shook his head. You kill her. You make her a martyr. The story gets worse, not better. David, the middle son who rarely spoke in these councils, surprised everyone by offering a solution. We don't kill her, he said quietly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. We use her. We control the narrative. The colonel leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. Explain. David stood and began to pace, his mind working through the problem as he would a poem, looking for rhythm and resolution. The enslaved population believes she has power. The overseers fear her. But we can reframe that belief. We announce that Ayodele is not cursed, but blessed, that her unusual eyes mark her as chosen by God for a special purpose. We make her a symbol of divine order, of the natural hierarchy that places us above and them below. We use their superstition against them, transform her from a threat into a tool of control. Martin scoffed. That's insane. You can't just rewrite reality with pretty words. But the colonel was nodding slowly, seeing the genius in it. Actually, you can. We bring in a minister, someone educated and credible. We stage a ceremony, a consecration of sorts. We declare that Ayodele's eyes are a mark of God's favor upon this plantation, a sign that our institution is blessed, that resistance to us is resistance to divine will. Thomas looked between his brothers and father with disgust. You're all cowards. The solution is fire and blood, not theater and theology. But he was outvoted. Within a week, Reverend Nathaniel Caldwell arrived from Nashville, a Presbyterian minister with political ambitions and flexible theology. He was paid handsomely to perform what the Whitmores called a ceremony of divine affirmation. The entire plantation was assembled, all 147 enslaved people, all the remaining overseers, neighboring planters and their families. Ayodele, now dressed in white cotton that made her skin glow like polished mahogany, was brought before the crowd. Reverend Caldwell placed his hand on her head and pronounced her a vessel of God's inscrutable will, a living reminder that the Lord works in mysterious ways, and that his order must not be questioned. The enslaved community watched in silence, their faces carefully neutral. But in their cabins that night, they spoke of blasphemy and reckoning. The ceremony changed nothing and everything. Ayodele remained the same girl. She had always been quiet, observant, unsettling. But the Whitmores had made a critical error in bringing so much attention to her, in elevating her from curiosity to symbol. They had given her a kind of visibility that could not be easily withdrawn, a platform that would eventually become her weapon. In the months following the ceremony, something shifted in Ayodele herself. She began to test the boundaries of her strange reputation. When Thomas Whitmore struck a field hand named Joseph for moving too slowly, Ayodele walked calmly to where the man lay bleeding and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You will heal," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "And he will not." She looked at Thomas with her mismatched eyes, holding his gaze until he looked away, discomforted by something he could not name. Joseph's wounds did heal, remarkably fast. Thomas Whitmore developed a fever a week later that lasted a month and left him 30 pounds lighter, sweating through sheets, haunted by nightmares he could not remember upon waking. The enslaved community began to bring Ayodele their problems, their fears, their questions about the future. She did not always answer, but when she did, her words carried weight. She told a woman named Sarah that her husband, sold away 5 years prior, was alive in Alabama. 6 months later, a traveling preacher brought word that confirmed it. She told a young man named Isaiah that he would die of snakebite before his next birthday. He was skeptical until the timber rattler found him in the tobacco field. She told Neka, her mother, that freedom was coming, but that it would be born in blood and fire, and that many who saw it would not survive to live in it. Neka asked, "Will I see it?" Ayodele's pale eye caught the lamplight, and in it, Neka saw something vast and terrible and beautiful. "You will see its beginning," her daughter replied, "but I will see its cost." By the time Ayodele turned 12 in 1859, she had become something the Whitmores had not intended. A prophet, a leader, a voice of something that plantation authority could not silence with whips or theology. The year 1859 brought tensions that stretched across the entire South like wire pulled to its breaking point, ready to snap and cut through everything it touched. In Tennessee, in Virginia, in every slave state, whispers of insurrection traveled through invisible networks. Field hands, speaking to house servants to free blacks in town, free blacks to conductors on the Underground Railroad, until information flowed like water finding cracks in stone. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October sent shockwaves of terror through white plantation society and sparks of desperate hope through the enslaved. Though Brown was captured and hanged, his actions proved that white men could fight against slavery with violence, that the abolitionist cause was not merely moral philosophy but militant conviction. On the Whitmore plantation, the news arrived like a match dropped in dry kindling. Colonel Whitmore increased patrols, forbade assemblies of more than 3 slaves, and imposed a 9 o'clock curfew, enforced by armed overseers the few who remained. But fear works both ways, and the white family felt it as acutely as those they held in bondage. Constance Whitmore began taking laudanum to sleep, her dreams haunted by visions of throats cut in the night, of flames consuming the big house, of black hands dragging her sons into darkness. Martin took to carrying 2 pistols at all times. Thomas organized a local militia, drilling poor whites in military formation, preparing for the race war he was certain was coming. And Ayodele, now 12 years old and fully aware of her own power, watched it all with those unsettling eyes that seemed to perceive not just the present moment but its consequences rippling forward into time. She had grown tall, her body beginning the transformation into womanhood, her features a striking blend of her mother's beauty and her father's sharp angles. though Martin Whitmore would sooner die than acknowledge the resemblance. Her reputation had spread beyond the plantation boundaries, beyond Crossville, carried by traveling preachers and slave traders, by merchants and patrollers, until in certain circles she was spoken of in the same breath as Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, not as a rebel who had acted, but as a prophet who was waiting, who was watching, who would know the exact moment when history was ready to turn. The final overseer to die before the war came was a man named William Casper, and his death was different from the others because it was neither accident nor mysterious circumstance. It was murder, plain and witnessed, and the murderer was Iodele's mother, Nika. It happened on a February evening in 1860, when frost covered the ground and breath came in visible clouds. Casper, drunk on corn whiskey and emboldened by the increasing paranoia that made white men feel they had to constantly reassert dominance, cornered Nika in the smokehouse, where she was hanging bacon. He put his hands on her, as Martin Whitmore had done 13 years before, as countless white men had done to countless black women since the first slave ship touched American shores. But Nika was not the same woman she had been. 13 years of watching her daughter grow into something powerful and strange had changed her, had taught her that submission was not survival, only slow death. When Casper tore at her dress, Nika reached for the butcher knife hanging on the wall, a blade kept sharp for splitting pig carcasses, and she drove it into his chest with all the strength of generations of rage. Casper stumbled backward, blood spreading across his shirt in a bloom of crimson, his eyes wide with disbelief that a slave woman would actually dare. He fell among the hanging meat, his body twitching, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. Nika stood over him, the knife still in her hand, and felt no regret, only a strange peace, the peace of having finally answered violence with violence. Iodele found her mother there, standing in the smokehouse with blood on her hands and death at her feet. Their eyes met, one pair brown and weary, one pair mismatched and knowing. "They will kill you for this," Iodele said quietly. Nika nodded. "I know, but I will die having chosen my own action, not theirs. I will die human." Outside, someone had heard Casper's final cry. Shouts echoed across the plantation. Footsteps pounded toward the smokehouse. The reckoning Iodele had foreseen was beginning, and it would consume everything. Pause here. In this moment, before the fire consumes everything, before the blood soaks into Tennessee soil, before Iodele's story transforms from history into legend. What you are witnessing is not merely the tale of a girl born with unusual eyes, it is the chronicle of how the unseen becomes undeniable, how the powerless accumulate power not through strength but through the one thing their oppressors cannot control: presence, prophecy, the refusal to be forgotten. If this story has gripped you, if you feel the weight of what is coming, then carry it forward. Subscribe to ensure you witness how this darkness resolves into myth. Comment below with what you believe Iodele truly was: prophet, witch, victim, or something the English language has no word for. Share this with those who understand that the most powerful hauntings are not of ghosts but of truths we tried to bury. Because what happens next will answer the question that has followed Iodele since birth. Are her witch eyes a window into the future, or are they the future itself, staring back at us, waiting for the world to catch up to what she already knows? They dragged Nika from the smokehouse in chains, her wrists bound so tightly the iron cut into flesh, drawing blood that dripped onto frozen ground like dark sacrament. The Whitmore family convened what they called a trial in the parlor of the big house, though it was no trial at all but theater, a performance of justice where the verdict had been written before the first word was spoken. Colonel Whitmore sat in his high-backed chair like a judge, like a king, like a god dispensing divine wrath. Martin stood behind him, stone-faced, refusing to look at Nika, refusing to acknowledge the woman he had violated 13 years prior. Thomas paced like a caged animal, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt, eager for violence, for blood, for the reassertion of order through terror. They allowed Nika no defense, no testimony, no appeal to mercy that did not exist. The colonel pronounced sentence: death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn, in view of the entire enslaved population, so that all would witness the consequences of resistance, of murder, of daring to believe that a black hand could strike a white life without cosmic retribution. But Before they took Nneka back to the slave jail, a windowless shed behind the barn, they brought Ayodele before her. The girl stood in the parlor, surrounded by wealth built on suffering, her witch eyes reflecting firelight from the hearth, turning one eye to burning amber and the other to cold silver. "Look at your daughter," Colonel Whitmore commanded Nneka. "Look at what your actions have condemned her to, a life without a mother, a life of increased scrutiny and suspicion." Nneka did look, and what passed between mother and daughter in that gaze was beyond the Whitmores' comprehension. Not goodbye, but instruction, not grief, but transfer of power, the passing of something ancient and unbreakable. That night, the night before Nneka's execution, Ayodele did not sleep. She sat outside the slave jail, her back against the rough wooden wall, feeling her mother's presence on the other side, separated by mere inches of timber yet divided by the unbridgeable chasm between condemned and living. The February moon hung low and full, casting shadows that stretched and twisted like living things. Around the plantation, enslaved people whispered in their cabins, some praying to Jesus, others to older gods whose names they half remembered, all knowing that tomorrow would mark a threshold, a point of no return. In the big house, Constance Whitmore could not sleep either, her body rigid in her bed, the laudanum bottle empty on her nightstand, her mind cycling through scenarios of retribution. Would the slaves rise up? Would they burn the house? Would she wake to find her throat cut? In his room, Martin stared at the ceiling, thinking of Nneka, of the act that had created Ayodele, of how a few minutes of force 13 years ago had led inexorably to this moment. He felt no guilt. Men of his time and class were not raised to feel guilt for such things, but he felt unease, the sense of standing at the edge of an abyss whose depth he could not measure. Thomas cleaned his pistol, loaded and reloaded it, checked his powder, his shot, preparing for the war he was certain would come, and Ayodele sat in the moonlight, her eyes open, unblinking, watching something the others could not see, the future unfurling like a scroll, the war that would come in a year, the blood that would drown the South, the freedom that would be born in fire, and her own role in the past, story not as victim, but as witness, as prophet, as the one who would survive to tell. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised snow. They assembled everyone, every enslaved person, every overseer, the entire Whitmore family in the yard between the big house and the slave quarters. A scaffold had been built in the night, rough lumber nailed together with grim efficiency, a noose hanging from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the wind. They brought Nneka out in chains, her head high, her face calm, and when they positioned her on the platform, she looked not at the rope or at the Whitmores, but at her daughter. Ayodele stood at the front of the assembled crowd, unmoving, her witch eyes locked on her mother's face. Colonel Whitmore read from a prepared statement about order and justice and the necessity of punishment. His words evaporated into the cold air, meaningless, forgotten even as he spoke them. When he finished, he nodded to the overseer who held the lever. But before that lever could be pulled, Nneka spoke, her voice carrying across the yard with unexpected power. "You believe you end something today, but you begin it. You believe you silence resistance, but you give it voice. The eyes you fear in my daughter will see your downfall. The war is coming, it is already here, marching toward you from the future my child perceives. And when it arrives, when your sons bleed in fields far from home, when your house burns and your wealth turns to ash, remember this moment. Remember that you built your kingdom on suffering, and suffering is a foundation that cannot hold." The lever was pulled. The rope snapped taut. Nika's body dropped and jerked and went still, and Ayodele did not cry, did not scream, did not look away. She watched every second, memorizing it, storing it like ammunition for a war not yet begun. The Civil War came to Tennessee in 1861, just as Nneka had prophesied, and it came with fire and blood and the complete inversion of the world the Whitmores had known. Fort Sumter fell in April. Tennessee seceded in June. By 1862, Union and Confederate forces were churning the state into a battlefield, and the Whitmore plantation found itself in the contested territory between armies, belonging fully to neither side, vulnerable to both. Ayodele, now 15, had become something beyond girl, beyond slave. She was an oracle, whom even the white family consulted in whispers, asking what was coming, where safety lay, whether their sons would return from war. Martin had died at Shiloh. shot through the chest in the bloodiest 2 days the continent had ever seen. David had been captured at Fort Donelson and languished in a Union prison camp. Thomas fought with partisan raiders, burning and killing with the fervor of a man trying to hold back history with violence. And then, on a night in October 1863, a Union cavalry unit swept through the plantation. They were black soldiers, former slaves themselves, wearing blue uniforms, carrying rifles, embodying the nightmare every white Southerner had feared, and the dream every enslaved person had nurtured in secret. They burned the big house not in rage, but systematically, methodically, erasing the architecture of dominion. Iodele stood in the yard and watched the flames climb toward the October sky, turning night into orange-lit day, the heat so intense it could be felt from 100 yards away. Colonel Whitmore and Constance were given time to flee. They ran into the woods. Suddenly, refugees. Suddenly, powerless. Suddenly, learning what it meant to own nothing, not even certainty of survival. What became of Iodele after the burning is a matter of legend, rather than documented history, which is perhaps fitting for a life that was always more myth than fact. Some accounts say she traveled north during Reconstruction, settling in Philadelphia, where she lived to be 93 years old, a respected woman in the community, a storyteller who mesmerized children with tales of the old days, of slavery and prophecy, and eyes that could see tomorrow. Other accounts place her in New Orleans, working as a healer and fortune teller in the French Quarter, sought by people of all colors who needed to know what was coming, who needed to believe that the future was knowable, and therefore survivable. Still other stories, the ones whispered in Tennessee, in the hills around Crossville where the Whitmore plantation once stood, claim she never left, that she haunts the burned ruins still, that on certain nights when the moon is full, you can see a figure standing where the big house once was, a woman with eyes that glow in 2 different colors, one pale as judgment, one dark as memory. What is known, what is documented, is that the Whitmore family never recovered. The colonel died penniless in 1867. Thomas was killed by bushwhackers in 1865, his body left in a ditch, unburied for weeks. David returned from prison a broken man and drank himself to death by 1870. The plantation was subdivided and sold to freedmen, to northerners, to anyone who didn't know or didn't care about the stories, and the stories persisted of a girl born with witch eyes, who saw death before it came, whose mother was hanged for daring to resist, who watched an entire world burn and then walked into legend, becoming not a person but a prophecy, not history but haunting, not forgotten but immortal, in the way that only the most dangerous truths can be immortal, by refusing, forever, to stay buried.